Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and you're listening to Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. This episode of Unpacking Israeli History is dedicated in memory of Armin Lindenbaum by his wife Jean and children Felice, Amiel, and Ariel Lindenbaum Sabag. If you're interested in sponsoring an episode of Unpacking Israeli History or just saying what's up, be in touch at noam@unpacked.media. And before we start, one more thing. Unpacking Israeli History is on Instagram. We're on YouTube. We're on TikTok. Just search Unpacking Israeli History. And as the kids say, smash that follow or subscribe button. Okay, yalla. Let's do this. Over the past few weeks, we've been talking about the big stories behind the news, the histories that led us to this moment. And all of those are so important for understanding not only today, but tomorrow. But history is not just the geopolitical, international stories. It's also the product of billions of individual people, their daily lives, their choices, their struggles, their triumphs. There's a German artist named Anselm Kiefer who wrote, "History is formed by the people, those who have power and those without power. Each one of us makes history." Meaning, history doesn't just happen. It's made by the collective actions of billions of people. And sometimes history is best told through the lives of a single person. Today, I am excited to talk with one of those people. She's lived through some of the events that we've discussed recently that have led us to where we are today. And she hasn't only lived through them, she's spoken out about them. Today, my conversation is with Roya Hakakian. Roya Hakakian is an Iranian-American writer, poet, and journalist whose work explores themes of exile, authoritarianism, and human rights, particularly the struggles of women and immigrants. Born into a Jewish family in Tehran and arriving in the United States as a refugee in 1985, she first gained acclaim for her memoir, Journey from the Land of No, detailing her youth during Iran's 1979 revolution. Her subsequent books, including Assassins of the Turquoise Palace and A Beginner's Guide to America, have received wide recognition for their narrative power and political insight. A former Persian poet and Guggenheim Fellow, she has written for major outlets like the New York Times and The Atlantic, collaborated on major TV journalism, and served on human rights boards. She's a fellow at Yale and the SNF Agora Institute, and a very influential voice on Iran, democracy, and immigration. Make sure to stick around after our conversation for our 5 fast facts and enduring lesson as I see it. Summarizing all the information that we covered in our discussion, Roya, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm so glad to be with you.
Roya, you and I first met each other a few months ago in Nashville, right? That's where we met.
And I fawned over you because I'm a fan of your podcast.
Oh, thank you. And I'm so happy to have you together with me and with our team today to have this conversation about the story of Israel and the story of Iran. I just blushed when you said that, but I totally skipped over it. But anyway, I want to start with the whole story of Iran through kind of a personal story. And we'll go through the history of the last few thousand years, frankly, in Iran. And I want to get to different episodes throughout Iranian history and also your story. I want to just kind of like weave all of that together. But before we do that, I wanted to pause. I wanted to take a moment and I wanted to ask, how are you doing today?
I'm very crestfallen. I thought that we had come to the very edge of the annihilation of the current regime, and while I didn't think that we needed to overthrow the regime or replace the regime, I just thought that a couple more days of what was going on, if had it continued, the destiny of Iran, the destiny of the region, Israel, the world could have been different. And the fact that they now will continue to be in power really is a huge blow.
Oh, wow. So interesting. So you look at the last few weeks and you say to yourself, you're actually not satisfied. Now, we don't know, like people might be listening to this in a month from now, in a year from now, but at this very moment, you're saying to me that you actually, you're not thrilled. You're not thrilled right now.
I would love to be proven wrong. I would love to be able to come back on your show, 3 months from now and say, Noam, I was wrong about everything. And, and it would be the first time I've apologized or confessed to my mistakes. But look, I am not even saying let's look at the course and the span of history for the last 100 years. I'm just saying let's look at the last year. Israel weakened Hezbollah tremendously, got rid of Nasrallah, and the dominoes fell. Lebanon has changed. It may not last, but Lebanon has profoundly changed. And there's hope for Lebanon to be a country very different from what it has been. Syria transformed. And we don't know exactly how Syria will sort itself out in the next 5 years. But for all intents and purposes, it looks a lot better than it did 2 years ago or even a year ago. So there was one more piece in this domino that needed to fall, and that was the supreme leader in Tehran. And the fact that he didn't, you have to realize, feeds into his 46-year narrative, which is God is with us.
Mm-hmm.
This was divine intervention,
Mm-hmm.
and I live because God wanted it so.
Wow,
And to think that gives him far more power to repress the people internally and to carry on with all the terrible policies that they were carrying on with to begin with.
Wow. So I wasn't expecting you to say crestfallen, but I hear what you're talking about. I didn't think about it from that perspective. I want to get into understanding Iran and the current day of Iran versus 50 years ago, and throughout this conversation. I think it's like one of the most sorry to speak about it in like an antiseptic way, like that, like I'm distant from it in some way, but like I find it fascinating to understand Iranian history. First of all, for the last couple thousand years, and then also, I'm just like that history nerd guy, which but I just find it so interesting. So I want to get into the understanding of your family's story, and because this is a history podcast, I want to weave it into the larger history of Iran. And I want to start way back, really way back. And I'll ask you a question about your family's ancestry in Iran, but I want to start way back. So I'm going to start by talking about the complicated history in Iran. So I'm going to go through a very quick deep dive. Not a deep dive, but like I'm going to go through a lot of history in a short amount of time. So listen to the history in Iran. Mm-hmm. From 678 to 550 before the Common Era, Jews are exiled to Babylon. And in 550 to 300 or so, around that time period, Cyrus, a great Persian leader, allows the Jewish people back into the land of Israel to rebuild the temple. But we have the story of Esther, by the way, a little bit after that, right? That's where that story comes from a little bit later. There's a whole amount of Torah scholarship, Hebrew Bible scholarship that flourishes in this empire from like around 200 to 500 of the Common Era. In this broader region, then there's the Muslim conquest at a certain point in time of Persia, and maybe I'm going to mispronounce the word because I always mispronounce this word. The Jews become Dhimmi or Thimi. How do you say it? Dhimmi. Okay, Dhimmi.
But there's an H after the
right. There's okay, Dhimmi. Okay, fine, fair enough. And then there's the Mongol rule. By the way, there's Mongol rule 13th to 14th century. From around 1500 to 1730, we start seeing the Safavid dynasty come in. So the Shia Islam becomes a state, or whatever state means at that point in time, religion. There's violence against Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Sunni Muslims. Then there's the Najasat laws are maintained, which are laws of impurity, meaning non-Muslims are impure. And what happened is Jewish people had to hold jobs that Muslims could not do, like cleaning excrement, handling gold and silver objects, serving as musicians and dancers. And then I heard about this. I'm going to say this for a little bit right now in the history part of this. I didn't know about this, but I want to give credit to the Center for Israel Education, who recently put out something that was fascinating. On March 27th of 1839, Jews first settled in the northeast Iranian city of Mashhad in 1741, some say 1735, when approximately 40 families were relocated by the Persian ruler Nader Shah from other parts of Iran. Nader Shah uprooted the Jews so they could guard the treasures he had brought to Mashhad after conquering India. He chose the Jews for this work because, as a Sunni Muslim, he did not trust the local Shiite population with his treasure. Mashhad's status as a holy Muslim city meant that it was close to non-Muslim settlement. Therefore, the Jews settled in a special district called Idgah, meaning place of celebrations. Mashhad's Jewish community grew and prospered as merchants and traders, but was almost entirely segregated from the Muslim residents of the city. In addition to their economic prosperity, Mashhad's Jews also developed a considerable Jewish life and education system. And here's what I really did not know. The tensions between the local Shiite population and the Jews erupted on March 27th, 1839. Now, I thought problems only emerged in 1979, but I'm reading this, and then it says, following an alleged misconduct by a Jewish woman, the Idgah was, maybe I'm not pronouncing that correctly, was attacked by a mob. Between 30 and 40 Jews were killed. The synagogue was burned. Homes were looted, and children were abducted in the violence that followed. Following the riots, the entire community of nearly 2,400 Jews were forced to convert to Islam, an event which became known as the Al-Dad. As has been the case in Spain in the 15th century, most of those who converted continued to practice Judaism in secret. The new converts were known as Jadid al-Islam, new to Islam. Some Jews left Mashhad and settled in Herat, Afghanistan, in order to escape conversion, while others went to Tehran or abroad. I did not know a lot of that. Okay, so then 1925
it was new to me too.
It's new to, okay. Like I just didn't know. I didn't know this. And then 1925 to 1979, there's major Jewish conversion to Baha'i, something that I heard, and major Jewish populations in Isfahan, Hamadan, and other cities that I will not try to pronounce incorrectly. And my apologies. But Shiraz, Tehran, and others emerge. And then 1979 happens. I want you to talk to me within all that history. You are Iranian. You're Iranian-American, but you're raised initially in Iran and your family's from Iran. Could you say a little bit about where your family history fits into this broader history of Iran?
There's something interesting when you were talking about Cyrus that I find fascinating, and I bet your listeners would too, which is that there is a belief that the current model of Jewish diaspora was set by Cyrus, meaning that Cyrus said, Jews, I set you free. You can return to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land if you want to. And some Jews said, we don't want to return. And then Cyrus says, well, if you don't want to return, then you need to contribute to the rebuilding of all that was destroyed, the temple and everything. And so in some ways, if the account that I've heard is correct, Cyrus was the one who said either, make Aliyah, or if you don't make Aliyah, it's your responsibility to make contributions to the health and well-being of Israel, which is really interesting. But so where does my family fit in?
Yeah.
I have been wondering about that myself. So a few years ago, I did one of those, DNA tests.
23andMe thing?
Yeah, I did the National Geographic one a long time ago. And I was wondering, did I have ancestry outside of Iran, somewhere else? I was hoping for, some European blondes to be related to me. But it turns out that our family was last traced to Spain. And then I assume that from Spain, we just trickled down to Iran and where we were. But this is to say that there was no other traces to, I was 99.9%, an Iranian Jew.
Right.
There was nothing else that they could find within the DNA. And my maternal side of the family was from Hamadan, which is where Esther and Mordechai's tombs are. And
Wow.
this is one of the most memorable events of my life, because we traveled to my mother's birth city when I was really little. And I remember walking into the tombs and being told that this is where Esther is and this is where Mordecai is. Um,
Wow. Wow. So it was like a big. It was like it was like a Hajj. It was like it was like a pilgrimage too. It was like something special to go to their tomb.
Completely.
That's so cool.
Something that, you said Iran's history with Jewry, with the world Jewry, is very complicated. I want to add that the adjective rich.
Mm.
The most sacred sites of Jewish history outside of Israel are in Iran.
Hmm.
So, we have the whether these places are really what they say they claim to be, or not, is of course including the story of Esther to begin with.
Okay.
But that's what's there. And
Wow.
so there is in Isfahan, the home of Sarah Bat Asher,
Hmm.
and then there is the tomb of Prophet Daniel,
Right.
and tons of synagogues, which ironically, shockingly, have turned to tourist sites in Iran. I had
Mm.
a friend who came to me a couple of summers ago and said, I was just in Iran for the summer, and guess what I did? And then he told me that there are tour guides who have created this tour of Jewish sites of Tehran,
Wow.
and because so many of them have been abandoned, they take tourists through former Jewish centers and synagogues and worship places and all.
Interesting. I want to get into different aspects of the history in a second also, but I'm just like, excuse my ignorance, but I'm going to assume people listening also might be ignorant also. Roya, if you went to Iran right now, would you feel safe?
I particularly wouldn't be safe, but that's because of my writings. I've been a persona non grata as far as the government is concerned for at least 20 years, because of what I've published. But there are Iranian Jews based in the United States who have traveled back and forth to Iran very often, up until
Mm.
very recently. And as you know, since you haven't mentioned, I'm sure you were coming to it, so I'll jumpstart. There is still about 8,000 Jews left in Iran.
Yeah.
And,
Which fun fact is the biggest Jewish population in the Middle East outside of Israel.
well, I'm not sure. I think that floats around, but
What
I think
else? Who's in competition?
Turkey.
Turkey. Okay.
So I
Okay.
think I think Iran used to have 20 until about 10 years ago, and then it started to plummet even more. And so I think Turkey is ahead of Iran right now.
Okay. So I mean, listen, if it's Turkey or Iran, the reality is, and this is the gist of this all
Don't
now.
say they're both the same.
No, 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 no. No,
Okay.
I'm not that American.
Okay.
But what I was going to say is that we have 8,000 or so Iranian Jews living in Iran. And like, okay, there used to be a lot more than that, hundreds of thousands.
In the 20th century, we didn't have more than 100.
In the 20th century, there was around, I think there was between 90 to 100,000
Yes.
in the 20th century, right? So
Yeah.
I'm gonna jump a bit to the modern era, and I want to talk about three distinct periods in Iran's history. The first is the 1940s to 1953. So I want to start there. I want to start with what was Iran like before the creation of the State of Israel, and did it change anything? Now, you wrote something in the Sapir journal. You said on his daily walks to school in Konzar, my father and his siblings were often pelted with rocks. That was on sunny days. On rainy days, they were not allowed to attend schools. The locals believed Jews to be najis, unclean, and feared that any splash of rainwater off their bodies onto theirs could dirty them too. Thus was the fate of my father's education tied to the whims of the clouds. Really poetically, beautifully written. What would you say about what it was like from 1940 to 1953? So, like, I always view it as from 48 to 79, things were good for Iranian Jews. Is that too simple?
No,
Is
no,
it
actually, it's actually very true. So
okay?
my father was a kid in the 30s,
Okay.
in the late 30s, and and Iran undergoes really major changes, and by many accounts, if not by all, the golden years of Iran, decades of Iran's life, at least in the modern times, where began with with the reign of the first Pahlavi Shah, who was Reza Shah, the father of the Shah who fell in 1979. And he came to power in the early 1920s. And by the way, one of the things that he did, which is hugely important to remember, is that he was the first Shah, again, in modern times, who or the first Shah compared to the other dynasties before him, who went to visit a synagogue.
Hmm.
So that was a huge statement of of acknowledgement of the Jewish community as a legitimate community, as a well-regarded community. But the reason he did that, I suspect, it was that the Pahlavi's project was to create a unified Iranian nation. Because you have to remember that Iran shares a border with Pakistan, with Iraq, with Afghanistan, and all these countries have had, and to a great degree continue to have, ethnic stripes within their own population. And Iran was not all that different, although Iran always had a much stronger and more unified sense of a peoplehood. But Reza Shah realizes that in order for Iran to really industrialize and make leaps towards modernization, the nation needs to feel that they're all one, that it's one people. So part of the reason he pays a visit to the synagogue and is part of the larger agenda of bringing in all the ethnicities, whether they're religious or ethnic minorities, in from the cold, and helping them all become and feel part of a single people. And that really gathers momentum after the 1940s, when the son of the Shah, after the end of World War II, is installed as the Shah of Iran, because his father was accused of having been an ally of Germany. And that's one of the, in case history is we have a part two and we need to have that discussion, we can. But he's totally misunderstood and misremembered in history. He wasn't an ally of the Germans. He was just trying to keep Iran out of the war. But
Okay.
that's besides the fact. So out of World War II, one of the changes that comes to Iran is that the son of that first Pahlavi Shah, who was very young at the time, becomes the king, and then the process of modernization really speeds up in Iran, and it's a time of prosperity for Iran in general. But the Jewish community's fortune completely changes, to the point that the traditional and sort of historic ancient Jewish ghetto in Tehran, while it remains where it was, which was in south of Tehran, busts up. In other words, if you're Jewish, it's not mandated that you live in that part of town. You can go anywhere you want. You can live in any neighborhood you want. And so Jews start to get out of that southern corner, which had a lot of stigma attached to it. You were poor if you lived there, and the quality of education and health and hygiene was low. And so Jews begin to move out and begin to take up residence throughout Iran, throughout Tehran, and there were no professional limitations really put on Jews. I was happy to hear that you were talking about how Jews as dhimmis were limited in the sort of jobs that they could take. So, from the late 1940s up until 1979, when the Iranian Revolution took place, Jews could be anywhere and do anything, which was mind-blowing.
Yeah. It's mind-blowing to me that's mind-blowing. Like, that doesn't sound mind-blowing to me. That sounds like
No, but
that
I
that ought
understand.
not be
Yeah,
mind-blowing.
absolutely. I mean, why should it be the fact? But
Right.
this happened while, Jews were being thrown out of Europe.
Right.
So it is really mind blowing that
Yeah.
while the
Yeah.
westernized, advanced European countries were doing to the Jews what they were doing, Iran was making such advances that it was allowing Jews to actually become absolute equal citizens.
So it's 53 to 79 now. Let's go there for a second. And I want to know what life was like under the Shah. I know there was a brief period where the Shah was overthrown by the elected nationalists in 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh, but then there was a CIA coup that took Mossadegh out of power, put the Shah back in, and the Shah ran a very pro-Western, but seemingly dictatorial country. And you grew up during this time period.
I came a little later, but okay. I wasn't alive in 1953. What does this?
So closer to the 70s,
Yeah.
in the 70s, let's say.
Mhm.
And I want to know what it's like for you first of all, to grow up there as a young Jewish woman. What was it like? What's like a story of? Did you interact with Muslims that lived in Iran with you? Was the Shah viewed as someone who was so bad? And it seems to me like there was 1979. There were Marxists, there were liberals, there were Islamists, there were feminists. There were a lot of people that overthrew the Shah. Now the Islamists consolidated power ultimately in 79. But it sounds to me like there was a lot of people that did not really appreciate the way that Shah was running the country. So I want to know what it was like for you. If you have any stories, and if you have any pushback on my description of it from 53 to 79.
Mhm. See, I think that the fairest way to kind of look at the Shah, the younger one who was overthrown, the second one, is to kind of look at the global backdrop. This is the age of, the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and everybody forgets this, and it is such a key piece of information that while we think of Iran as a Shiite country surrounded by Iraq and Afghanistan and all these radical Muslim nations, to the north of Iran is the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
And the impact of the Soviet Union and its culture and its politics on the Iranian elite was huge.
Hmm.
Huge. More than anything that Shiism has ever done was the influence that was coming from the Soviet Union into Iran, and with all the full package of Marxist, communist propaganda. So, was the Shah bad? Well, the Shah was a guy who was modernizing Iran, who had given equal rights to women. My God, women, his father forced women to set aside their veils because he wanted the society to modernize. So there were, he sent out cops who went and pulled the scarf, pulled the hijab off the heads of women. And, a whole generation of women in the 30s were traumatized by that experience. So you fast forward, and his son gives equal rights in marriage, equal rights in inheritance, and allows women to join the workforce, which is a huge, huge leap, evolutionary leap, evolutionary political leap for the Iranian society. And it's actually where Ayatollah Khomeini, who then leads the opposition against the Shah and overthrows him, picks on what he had done to allow women to become equal citizens, because he thought, this was corruption to let women expose their hair, to let women wear mini skirts, to let women go to work. And he says in a lot of his sermons, these women go to work and they are so distracting, men can't do their work. And therefore he's corrupting the society, and on and on and on and on. And that's all he was talking about, in the early 60s. So he brings all these changes to the society Okay, but he's also a Middle Easterner ruler who it doesn't exactly know how to create a democracy because he himself hasn't really experienced it,
Hmm.
right? And there is no model that he can aspire to and say, "Oh, my father, had a democratic society, so I know how to build it." He didn't. He had to create it from scratch. So in those ways, as far as civil rights were concerned, as far as freedom of press, freedom of expression were concerned, he was terrible. And writers lived under censorship, but all of that were amplified by 1,000 because of the communist and the Marxist propaganda that basically dominated the Iranian literary and intellectual elite.
Wow. So what about you though in the mid 70s? Were you not part of the revolution? Were you oppositional to it? Were your parents nervous about it?
Well, I talk about all this in my memoir at length, and
And everyone should read the memoir.
yeah, Journey from the Land of No. But yes, so I was 12 years old when the revolution in 1979 takes place. So you can do the math, and I was excited about the revolution because, you know,
Wow.
what young Jewish person was not excited about any revolution anywhere in the world? I mean, I mean, wasn't Trotsky a Jew? What young Jew ever said no to being on the forefront of revolutionary change? It was also that it was really a moment, my first time, that I was seeing uh, sort of a collective effort, a collective coming together of the whole nation towards something. And it was very exciting to watch. Thousands of people are marching on the street chanting the same thing. You can't it was hugely exciting. But it was obviously, as far as the Jewish community was concerned, a division between elderly or elder Jews. I always say, 40 and up, and 40 and under. So if you were a younger Jew, if you were a high school student, especially if you were a university student, you were being stirred by this revolutionary promise, which at the time wasn't an Islamic, utopian society. It was all about, and uh, greater freedom and democracy and a equal society where and Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the cleric who led the revolution, really before he came to power, really squeezed all the juice out of these ideas because he realized that the communists and the Marxists were very popular. So he amplified and echoed a lot of their messages. So he came and added to it, and he said, "I am going to come back to Iran and make all utilities free for all Iranians. So nobody would have to pay for electricity, for water, for gas, for this, for that.
Right.
We have oil. Why should we pay for anything?"
Right.
And,
It sounds like the fourth grader who's running for president and tells everyone they have recess all day kind of thing.
exactly, exactly, and people somehow believed him.
Okay.
That's worse because not only he was a fourth grader,
Right.
but the country that bought it was a country of fourth graders at the time. Um, so so he came to power in February of 1979, on February 11th, and the Shah had already left the country about 10 days before that, and then electricity didn't become free. Let me just leave it at that.
But you weren't afraid. So that I think that's something that I just learned because I did not know this. I always imagined that the Jewish community in Iran in 1979 was not in favor of the revolution because the revolution, at least soon thereafter, became the function was to subvert American power in the Middle East. To as part of the IRGC's goal was to um, n- not really appreciate America, take down America, and death to Israel. But is that not the
No, that's totally true. So,
so the
uh,
under 40-year-olds were okay with the death to Israel stuff in the
no,
Jewish
no,
world?
they weren't okay. We thought that it's part of, I mean, the majority of even under 40-year-olds took it as sort of this feverish stuff that they were saying, but they didn't really mean it, which ironically, is how Iran has been justified to the rest of the world for the past 46 years. So, yeah, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad came to Columbia University to give a talk,
He's the former Iranian president. Right.
president,
Yeah.
and he said, "Oh, there are no gays in Iran," which made the whole auditorium blow up when he said that with laughter. And then Saturday Night Live made a skit about it, which I still watch after all these years. But he also said that we intend to wipe Israel off the map of the world. And then everybody else said, "Oh, he doesn't really mean it. He doesn't really mean it. He's being poetic. What he means is that, you
Sounds
know,
like Emerson.
but what I'm trying to say is that this is how Iran's very violent rhetoric has been justified. That they say it, but they don't mean it. This is
Mm.
how the language works. My foot. But in 1979, you have to remember something really important. Not only the piece about Soviet Union, which is very significant to remember, is something that I want to leave you with. But the other is that there are no Osama bin Ladens.
Mm.
There is no Sinwar. There was no ISIS. There was no Taliban. None of this existed in 1979. And because none of that existed, when he was saying all the things that he was saying, people didn't have a historical reference to say, "Oh my God, this is very dangerous
Mm.
because he's going to build tunnels under Tehran and then, stage attacks on, this one and that one. And he's
Mm.
really going to, arm people to go into Israel and behead people." Because a lot of Iranian intellectuals actually looked at Khomeini and said, "He looks like Mahatma Gandhi."
Mm.
That's
Wow.
what they thought of. They thought, this guy in this turban and cloak. He didn't remind them of sort of all the dangerous Islamic fundamentalist figures who showed up after he did,
Mm.
after he first appeared. He appeared like another nationalist in the region who wanted independence and sovereignty.
So fascinating. I did not know this take at all. I just didn't know this. And so we have 79 now, and I want to know, you live there. You left in 85, I believe, right? So
84.
just
Yeah.
you left in 84. Okay. So just like why did you choose to leave? And I think that and what I'm interested also in understanding Iran from 79 to today. There's a study that was done by the Group for Analyzing and Measuring Attitudes in Iran, GAMAN, and this is something that I just keep on reading about, because I keep on saying to myself, I didn't know this, and I should have known it, but I'm learning it now. It seems to be the case that only 32% of Iranians identified as right now as Shia Muslim. It says that 73% oppose the use of religion in laws. It talks about how Iran versus Egypt versus Saudi Arabia versus Turkey versus Indonesia and Pakistan. It seems like Iran is actually, of the people there, are the least practicing of the religion. Now, this makes sense now when I see pictures of 60s and 70s of Iranians. They look very Western. They look very European in many ways. And when people look at the Middle East, they see one thing. They see deeply religious. They see maybe and I like religion as much as the next guy, but I'm saying they don't look like the Western world. And yet, when you look at the studies, and only 32% of whatever of Iranians identify as Shia Muslims compared to the 95% official number. And you see that only 40% say they pray daily or something like that. Around 60% oppose the mandatory hijab. It's like, I'm so interested to understand Iranian society versus the IRGC is since 79. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I mean, I get very frustrated because cameramen and news broadcasters go into Iran. And of course, it's very attractive when you see a crowd at a Friday prayer, and they're chanting and they're throwing their fists into the air and saying death to America, death to Israel. It's good. It's good visuals, especially if you don't follow the language, if you're an English speaker, don't know what the hell they're saying. But it's exciting. It's a bunch of people. They look really worked up, and they're dressed in a funny way, and they're very actively, doing things with their arms and fists and things. So as opposed to, an underground Iranian rock music group or a bunch of rappers who look like you and me. And
Everyone says I look like a rapper. That's true.
well, you could.
Okay, thank you.
It takes very little, but we're not all that interesting for the cameras,
Right.
because they're looking for what's exotic and what it reinforces the narrative, which from 1979 onward is that Iran is religious and we misread the country. Iran is religious and we misread the country. Um, um, so that's what's going on. I mean, all what the statistics that you just recounted, all that really says is that here's a nation that's very dissatisfied with its leadership, and what it's decided it can do now that it can't successfully overthrow it is to define itself in opposition to it through daily practice, or actually, I should say daily non-practice. So they don't pray. And by the way, one of those statistics also says that Iranians are having less babies than any of their neighbors. Actually, the birth rates in Iran are so low, they match the European birth rates, which is, one more sign of a secular society. Another very interesting statistic is also the one that the ADL has been doing, of sort of the global anti-Semitism index.
Yeah. What is
And
that?
whenever you look at, or the ADL has looked at Middle East and North Africa, the rates or the frequency or the occurrence of anti-Semitism in Iran is significantly lower in the Middle East and North Africa compared to everybody else, and so and there was one that they did in 2010, and then there was a second one 10 years later, and both substantiate the same thing, that Iran is the least anti-Semitic nation in the region, and you must have seen in the research that you did, you saw that there were other than official protests in Tehran in after October 7th, there were no popular protests in support of October 7th or in support of Hamas. And in fact, the opposite of it happened.
That's
People at a soccer stadium, when the flag of Palestine went up, started chanting, "Take the flag of Palestine and shove it."
right.
And
Forget Palestine, think of us was the idea, I think. Right.
it was that, but after October 7th, when at the soccer stadium they showed the flag,
Yeah.
they were more vulgar than they had been in the past. So.
Right. But could you just share one? I have one more question for you about the future of Iran. You just busted a few misconceptions that I had, and if you busted a few misconceptions that I had, then you're going to do that for so many people. So I thank you for that. Do you have any stories of little Roya in Iran? I know that's in your memoirs, but is there any story that you can share with me about, I don't know, a moment that you felt Jewish in Iran, a moment that you felt Iranian in Iran, a moment, I don't know, something about your upbringing. I'm imagining a 12-year-old Roya, that's confused about the revolution. I want to be part of it, but it seems to be there's some things about it that maybe don't speak to me, but some things that maybe do speak to me. Is there a moment, a story that you can share?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think, I go to shul because, we all go to shul. But part of the reason, my additional reason to go to shul is because I am really blown away. And I'm sure other people find this to be an odd statement because, every Jew must feel that way. But I'm blown away by how I can be in a shul in the United States, in Connecticut, and still hear the same tunes that I heard. For instance, Adon Olam, is sung in the same exact way when people don't try to modernize and change. And whenever they do, I get really upset. I'm like, I am coming to hear
Yeah.
that Adon Olam
Right.
in with that tune. Don't change it. It takes me back to everything I remember. It makes me feel like I never left. It makes me feel like, there's continuity. But so a lot of my memories of childhood are associated, with my father holding my hand, walking me to synagogue on Friday evenings. It's about, being rowdy in the courtyard of synagogue, and everybody, all the adults shushing us all the time. And one of the things I like about my synagogue currently is that, nobody shushes the kids.
Yeah, that's
It's
great. No
really
shushing.
nice. I know I'm in a more civilized society when I realize that nobody wants to quiet down the kids. Um, and so it's a lot of that. But at the moment of the revolution, yes, I felt torn in many ways because, one memory that I really worked hard to build up in my memoir is of a time when, in an act of protest prior to the fall of the Shah, all Iranians were supposed to go to their rooftops and chant "God is great." So my mother and I are on the rooftop. It's pitch black. It's 9 p.m. at night, and there is no light anywhere, and I'm standing with my mom and dad, and it's really exciting because everybody's doing the same thing, and it's dark, and it was really cinematic. And then they start chanting Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. And yes, I was 12, but I was really full of myself. And I already was thinking that I'm a great writer, and my language is Persian, and Allahu Akbar is Arabic, and so I wasn't worrying that I'm a Jew. How can I say Allahu Akbar? I was worrying that I am a Persian, great
Mm-hmm.
Persian future of the Persian literature. How could I say Allahu Akbar? And then I'm torn. Meantime, my mom and dad are saying that they are scared. My father was elbowing my mother, saying, if you don't say Allahu Akbar, you upset the goyim, so why
The
don't you
non-Jews,
say?
yeah. Yeah.
You know? And
Mm.
so I'm standing there kind of wondering, what's going on. But at the same time, there is electricity in the air. The idea that all of your neighbors are on their rooftops and they're all chanting the same thing is really exciting. Of course, uh, what is incredibly earth-shattering to me is that those two words, Allahu Akbar, never left the theater of the Islamist theater that we saw unfold. And exactly on October 7th, when they were pushing Naam Alivi into the van, they were also saying Allahu Akbar. And
Mm.
I could not remember that, how I first was introduced to these two words and where it led.
No. Well, that is profound. That is profound, and the connection. I'm gonna have to reflect on this right after, because this dialectic between being Persian in Iran versus being Shia Muslim in Iran seems like there's a real tension between
Yeah.
these two elements, right?
Yes. Yes. So Ayatollah Khomeini, who's the cleric that leads the revolution, and then becomes the supreme leader, and then his replacement is the current supreme leader. He cares nothing about Iranianness. He's all about Islam. And one of the things that he's trying to do from the moment he gets there is to really quash all the manifestation of this Iranian identity, because it gets in the way of this, greater Islamic hegemony that he's envisioning. He wants to be the leader of the Muslims of the world. And if these, pesky Iranians keep, pressing that they are a different nation, that they have a different language, that they have, a different culture, that gets in the way of creating this, unified Islamic, greater Islamic nation that he wants to lead. And so one of the things that he immediately does after he returns is that he says, to hell with the Iranian New Year. Now, the Iranian New Year happens on the first day of spring. So it's a celebration of the arrival of spring. And it's a pagan tradition that has remained in the country since the reign of Zoroastrianism, which was a pagan religion and had nothing to do with Islam. In fact, Iranians were forced to abandon Zoroastrianism and become Muslim when Islam came to Iran. And people reacted so intensely to the no celebration of the New Year in Iran that they had to walk it back, and they had to say, "Oh, we didn't mean that you couldn't, but what if we do X, Y, and Z?" And you can also see it in the way it, see this tension in the way that the propaganda out of Iran over this war that just ended came out. So, usually all the Iranian leadership is talking about Islam, 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 Islam.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But as soon as Iran was attacked and they needed to bring the nation together, it was all, Cyrus the Great and the motherland and the, and patriotism. These are things that they never talk about. It's never about Cyrus. It's never about ancient Iran. It's never about that grand civilization. It's always just about Islam. But the moment they were threatened and they needed something bigger to thematically connect the people and rally them, it was all that Persian identity and Iranian past.
So why do you think, Roya? I'm gonna ask this last question as a twofolder. Why do you think? Because from hearing you, I kind of get the sense that most Iranians, and from the stats I read, and from the history, and going back to the 60s and 70s, and even before that, and we see this exploring the history. You see this tension between being Persian and being Muslim within Iran. Why is it the case that Iranians have not overthrown this regime, a counter revolution, if the majority of them do not seem to want to live this sort of way? I mean, why is it the case that the regime change hasn't taken place if so many Iranians I do not want the IRGC to be in charge? And then I want to ask you, I never like to ask people to predict the future, but I want to hear from you if you could share with us what your dream for Iran is. What do you dream about as part of Roya the poet? What do you dream about for the future of Iran?
Okay, so I don't know. I can't really say why the regime is still standing,
Okay.
despite all the pressures. But I can also say that it, look at Venezuela, look at Russia, look at China, and these are only three examples. There are several others. Belarus, none of these nations have been able to overthrow their regimes, and I think part of it is because there is a solidarity. There is, during the Cold War, the solidarity was between all the communist countries. They were a solid bloc. Now we're facing a different unified front. And that different unified front is China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea. And they prop each other up and they spare no amount of violence in order to quash their local movements. That's one thing. And of course, there is no unified coalition in opposition to the regime, which is a second very important factor. But my dream for Iran is I think what I dream in some ways for the future of Israel. My dream for Iran is for it to become a democratic society, a society where women can be women. Women can have the choice to dress as they wish. My dream is for Israel and Iran to have relations just as they did, in the 60s and 70s. My dream is for Iranians not to have to leave their country in order to thrive elsewhere. And I think that's not just good for Iran. It will change the region if such an Iran comes into being. Iran is hugely influential regionally, and it's a huge country. And just as its Islamic Revolution in 1979 changed the region for the worse, it's a better future, a democratic future in Iran can also change the region.
Amen. How awesome is Roya? Seriously, just a powerhouse. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did, where we could really explore Iranian history and Iranian society in a way that I think a lot of people just don't know so much about. But we learned a lot, so that was pretty cool. So it's hard to summarize so much history, but as always, here are your 5 fast facts, plus a bonus nerd corner alert. Number 1, Jewish history in Iran goes back nearly 3,000 years. In fact, Iran has one of the highest concentrations of Jewish holy sites outside of Israel. I did not know this, including the tombs of the prophet Daniel, Mordechai, and Esther, and even Serach bat Asher. Nerd corner alert about Serach. She doesn't get a lot of mention. And yes, this may be the first nerd corner alert in a 5 fast facts ever. So take that. Serach bat Asher is the granddaughter of the Jewish people's great-great-great-great-grandfather Jacob, the daughter of his son Asher. She shows up in the book of Numbers 46:17, I believe. Fact check me on that. When Moses surveys the Israelites, the only woman mentioned. And anyway, just that's my nerd corner alert in the 5 fast facts. Number 2, Iran was tolerant of its Jewish minority until the rise of Shia Islam in the 16th century, when Jews began to be considered impure. Now, they still had a, broadly speaking, decent relationship often, but between the 16th and 20th century, Jewish life in Iran was marked by the occasional outbursts of anti-Semitic violence, forced conversions, which you heard about, and ghettoization. Okay, number 3, all that changed with the rise of Reza Shah Pahlavi, who recognized the importance of uniting all minorities under a single national identity. He was the first political leader in Iran to visit a synagogue, heralding a new age for Iran's Jews. Like all kings, Reza Shah and his son Mohammad Reza was not bastions of democracy and liberalism per se. Mohammad Reza was overthrown in part because of his illiberal policies, which included crackdowns on free speech and political dissidents. That said, many Jews viewed him as a modern-day Cyrus, ushering in a new golden age for their once persecuted community. Number 4, but that golden age came to an end when Ayatollah Khomeini seized power in 1979, forcing Persian Jews to choose between being fully and authentically Jewish and Zionist, which is part of their identity, and being good citizens of the Islamic Republic, a tension that Roya explores in her memoir. Check that out. And number 5, and yet, surveys indicate that Iranians are the least anti-Semitic people in the entire Middle East, signaling that when the regime collapses, Jews will once again be free to be their full selves without fear in Iran. Those are your 5 fast facts, but here's one enduring lesson as I see it. It's tempting sometimes to take a narrow view of history, to zoom in and assume that the facts of the present will remain the facts of the future, that what is happening now will never stop. And if you're an Iranian living under an oppressive regime that has spent the past 46 years silencing and torturing you, it's easy to despair, to look at the multiple failed attempts at revolution and believe that the regime is immovable, that this will always be your lot. But history teaches us otherwise. To study history is to be freed from the shackles of the present, to be free to imagine a different world, because things are changing all the time. The Jews who were exiled from Judea in 586 BCE could not have imagined a moment when they'd go back to rebuild. They dreamed of it. They wrote and prayed and sang and wept by the rivers of Babylon. But who among them could have envisioned that in just a few short decades, everything would change? History is frequently grim, and sometimes it's even depressing. But it can also be hopeful. And if history teaches us anything, it's this: profound change is not only possible, it's guaranteed. For better or for worse, nothing is forever. As my grandmother of blessed memory, Mama Bashi, used to say, the only thing constant in life, Noam, is change. And that means there is always hope. Hope for change, for improvement, for revolution. And our responsibility as students of history, as people who are trying to shape the future, is to remember that, to identify and seize those opportunities to build a better world. Unpacking Israeli History is a production of Unpacked, an Open Door Media brand. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend who you think will appreciate it, and leave us a rating on Apple or Spotify. 5 stars doesn't hurt you. It doesn't hurt to do that. And it really helps other people find our podcast. And one last thing, I love hearing from listeners. So email me at noam@unpacked.media to share your thoughts. Our amazing, amazing guest today was Roya Hakakian. This episode was produced by Rifki Stern. Our team for this episode includes Adi Elbaz, Alex Harris, and Rob Pera. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for listening. See you next week.